I think we are live.
We are live, calling Chris Anderson in London.
Well, this is London, calling Chicago.
Calling Chicago. We are here, and welcome anyone who's joining us to History Happy Hour. And we're here every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook page. And we'll just wait a few moments, Chris, for people to join us. Doreen says we look alive. And it's great to look alive. I think that's an important way to look here.
So, Doreen, I have to send you a picture. I went by the house of the person who founded the old Vic Theater. So, since you're our amateur theater person, I'll have to send you a picture of that.
And so we're here every Sunday, and also all of our old shows. All 10 of the previous shows we've done now. Chris, we've done 10 shows before this one. They're all on all archived on YouTube as well. Please jump in with a comment. Emily and Tom, welcome, and everybody, let us know that you're here. Let everybody else know you're here.
So somebody's listening to us tonight.
We're still getting an audience, Chris. It's pretty good. So listen, we have to. It wouldn't be History Happy Hour without the infamous History Happy Hour open. So here we go.
Ta-da.
Ta-da. Yeah, boom. So the bar is open.
And what do you have at the bar? Well, we should ask you. I mean, we should.
Oh, well, we'll ask you when we bring Hugh in, but he's not here yet. I have a beer with a very small head there.
Well, I have a Spitfire again.
Okay.
Really?
Well, Spitfire, very appropriate for our topic today.
I thought so.
Beautifully done. It's probably worth. Well, Yakir Katz is calling me on the phone. So this is a bad time, Yakir. But
you should just not worry about it. There you go. It'll go away.
So 80 years ago today, I don't know. Here it is. Hang on. This is a great start here, folks. 80 years ago today, the British military was in the middle of Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people, British and French soldiers from Dunkirk, and it's in many ways kind of the opening act of the legendary summer of 1940 in Britain with the Dunkirk, and you have the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, and that is our topic today. And we have a terrific guest here to share that topic with us, and I want to bring him on and introduce to you Hugh Macdonald. And Hugh, welcome.
Thank you.
Hugh is a Blue Badge guide in London, and those are the folks who know more about London than you and I could ever dream of knowing, and who are willing to share it, and frequently do. And he also ventures out of London from time to time when they let him, and goes across the channel there to do tours in such places as Waterloo or Dunkirk or World War I tours. And he's recently designed a Blitz walking tour in London. He has a cool hyphenated name. He has a posh British accent because he went to Harrow. He has a painting with dogs behind him. You're going to love hearing from Hugh Macdonald-Buchanan. That is a good intro.
Thank you very much indeed. This intro I've had for a very long time.
Well, thank you. I'm going to put that on my resume.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Tell us about that amazing painting behind you.
Well, the painting behind me is of a red setter, painted in 1852, commissioned by somebody called the Procurator Fiscal of Edinburgh, who was the head of the administration of Edinburgh at the time. And on the face of it, it looks like a sentimental Victorian picture. You know how the Victorians love their dogs and so on and so forth. This is a picture painted in the post-clearance age, when the landscape you see behind the dog is no longer used for cattle grazing, or whatever locals would use. It was used as sporting playground by the new rich and the new wealthy. And the 1850s and 1860s, the rich and the wealthy of England and of Scotland were beginning to rediscover the Highlands and buying great swathes of it and establishing a different culture, which to an extent persists today, because so much of the Highlands of Scotland today is owned by huge estates, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70,000 acres owned privately, specifically for the purpose of sporting, which today is commercial rather than just private. So there's a little story behind that.
So
picture.
that painting was painted about the same time then that all those people up in the Highlands told my relatives to piss off, right? And
essentially that.
Yeah, okay, good.
But the point is they welcome you back, you see.
Yes, they do. Well, see, I show you the painting behind me, but it's over in the corner, but it's just signed Bob Ross. So
So, Chris, you want to start us off with a
Well, I thought discussion. Yeah, no, I was really excited to have Hugh come on the trip. We before all this craziness happened, Hugh and I had made a trip over to France to do some recce on the Battle of Britain and Dunkirk trip, and so we got to see a lot of the sites associated with the British in France in 1940. And aside from seeing some really terrific sites and discovering some really cool history, one of the things that Hugh and I started talking about was that we think too often people look at Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain and the Blitz as three kind of separate, unconnected events. And really, it should be looked at as one event. So we started talking a lot about that. And then we also started talking a lot about kind of the legacy of the Blitz and how the memory of the bombing or people's perception of what it was has kind of colored things into our day today. And then, well, COVID happened and we started this show, and I thought, what can we have people on to talk about? And I thought this would be a very interesting topic. And it's the 80th anniversary. So there you go.
Well, Hugh, let's start with Dunkirk. What's going on 80 years ago today, roughly speaking?
Roughly speaking, is the Allies, let's say French, British, Belgians, and the Dutch, their military forces were completely devastated by one of the most extraordinarily successful lightning campaigns in history. On the very day, excuse me, that Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister, on the 10th of May in 1940, the Germans launched their Blitzkrieg attack. And within weeks, you have 1.5 million Allied troops, French, British, Belgians, and Dutch, cut off in the northern part of northern France and forced into a pocket in which they have to retreat back towards the only exit, or the only viable exit at the time, which is this port of Dunkirk. Dunkirk isn't an ideal port to retreat out of. First of all, it's a single port. There's lots of people having to get through it, lots of kit, lots of hardware. It's not a big port by the standards of the time. But when the bag collapses and you have all those troops retreating back, that's exactly what's happening, pretty much exactly on the days that we're speaking about now. In the initial phases of this collapse, the casualties for the British Expeditionary Force are really quite small. It isn't until you get the Battle of Arras, which is on the 20th of May through to about the 21st of May, that the whole thing begins to gel in that last-ditch defensive system. And the story from then, going back towards Dunkirk, is of a series of last-ditch rearguard actions, hoping to shore up a line against this enormous pressure of the German troops coming in. And you're beginning to see the front line break up. So by the time you get into the few days before Dunkirk, you see a whole series of pocket actions. And the reason for that is, I think, twofold. First of all, the British, with quite a small army, made up their mind on the 19th, actually, that this is going to be a forlorn hope. And there is never going to be a major counterattack that's going to stem the flow. So they begin to pull their way back towards Dunkirk. The French armies are basically broken in two. The French First Army's had part of it cut off. The rest of it gets pocketed up in Lille. The Seventh Army, which should have been in reserve at Reims, park that story for the moment, is right up in the north. And that's broken in two because as part of the French desperate action to try and hold up this oncoming panzer attack, which comes from Sedan towards Abbeville on the coast, they try and get parts of the 7th Army back to hold it up. It doesn't work. And of course, these forces are now overstretched, although they're retreating back into a smaller pocket. And in the conventional sense, you would say they're retreating back onto interior lines and able to consolidate their front. It actually doesn't work like that. The panzers are able to swivel round once they cut this corridor from east to west and come up essentially behind the French army, and the British Expeditionary Force start rolling up from the flank. So the pace of the movement coming back from what would have been an orthodox frontline operation is beginning to discombobulate the organization of the forces, combined with the fact there's a very, very laborious command and control system. So by the time you get to late May, it is quite clear, and the planning is beginning to happen for an evacuation from Dunkirk. And it is going to be an evacuation for the British Expeditionary Force primarily, but Churchill, who is desperate, absolutely desperate to keep the French in the game, keeps having meetings. He travels from London to Paris a lot to meet with the French and say, look, we're going to be with you. For heaven's sake, keep on fighting. And the French and the British begin to take a different strategic view on what they want to achieve out of this retreat. The British and certainly forces on the ground just want to get back home and maintain the only European army that Britain has in the game. And I should also say that they want to try and save as much of their fighter force, Royal Air Force, as much as possible. The French, however, think that they're going to hunker down around Dunkirk, using it as a supply base with a defensive shield on the outside, and perhaps buying time so the French forces beneath, let's say, south of the Seine of the Somme can come back and do a pincer attack and restore the issue. So you're beginning to have emotional and strategic contradictions within the alliance. But the key thing for Britain is they need to get that expeditionary force back to the UK, because it is the only European territorial force that they have.
I should say that we lost Chris for a moment, but I think he's here and just coming back to us now. Yeah. So I won't ask you to repeat all that for Chris to do. But I was it's funny, you guys were talking about the Dunkirk, the Blitz spirit. There's there's a thing called the people talk about the Dunkirk spirit, that this is it's the Mrs. Miniver. This is England, London. It's before London can take it, but it's the idea of that this is where our plucky stand really sort of starts. And how real is that for people back in Britain? I was thinking about the fact that I'm in Chicago. There's lots of stuff going on out here in the streets today with the National Guard and protests and all sorts of stuff. But if you want to, you can completely ignore that and go about your life. So how much does the Dunkirk spirit really does it exist? How much attention is all of Britain paying to this as these hundreds of thousands of people are being evacuated? Well,
first of all, the Dunkirk spirit, the Blitz spirit, the Battle of Britain Spirit, has become legend in British culture and British history. And it's been invoked today. You know, the story about the little boats, got a couple there, going off to the beaches. People today have referred to small companies making PPE for the COVID crisis as being akin to the little boats going off to the beaches at Dunkirk. So it is invoked. But the interesting thing about your question, which is the one as to how people perceived it at the time, there was a spontaneous reaction by the British public that interpreted the evacuation from Dunkirk as a sort of victory. You know, the boys are back. We've escaped a major defeat. The European army is back. And this is before Winston Churchill has got to grips with his enervating speeches to Parliament or broadcast on the radio. And you can see it in the press. You can see it in some of the pictures at the time. You know, when people are being taken off the beaches and brought back to Dover and the various other ports on the south coast, ladies are out there with packages of sandwiches, you know, flasks of tea. They're putting bottles of beer through the railway windows of the troops that they're being taken off into the interior to find billets. This was a spontaneous reaction, in collusion, of course, with the press. But it's before the politicians had got onto the bandwagon and started making a propaganda virtue of it. And you will remember that Churchill's great comment that he referred to Dunkirk as a great deliverance. But victories aren't made out of deliverances. But the public believed that this was a great deliverance even before the propaganda system got to it. And one shouldn't forget, really, that a lot of British military history has revolved around strategic evacuations. I'm thinking in particular of the one in January 1809, when Sir John Moore was evacuated from Spain. You know, this is already part of the psychology of the British public. They understand how these things work. And the fact that the boys got back home, as Vera Ling would say, was a major emotional sense of gratitude at the time. And it's interesting because polls were taken between Dunkirk and the Blitz, say September. So we're talking between early June and September time. And these, but when I said polls, what I mean is a system called massed observation, whereby the Ministry of Information employed people to go out and just mingle with the crowds. You know, somebody would go and sit on the tube train, or somebody go and sit on a railway carriage, or somebody walk the crowds going to work to gauge the mood. And there was this feeling of stoic resistance. You know, we can do this before the bombing starts. And so it was massively important at the time. As time has gone on, and you look at it today, it is seen in a sentimental way, which has obscured the way in which perhaps historians ought to look at it. It's very difficult to look at what happened then until you picked away the rose-tinted glasses and you picked away the emotional aspects, you pick away the propaganda, and you actually really get down to the nuts and bolts of what people think. And the evidence of what the people thought at the time are contained in these records of massed observation. And it's very impressive. It was a spontaneous emotional reaction at the time.
We have a question from one of our viewers, and I should say, as I mentioned before, we're having some technical issues today, maybe a very heavy internet usage day in the world or in the United States with everything going on. So we hope to have Chris back joining us shortly. But we have a question from Ross here, and I don't know if you can see that, Hugh, but Ross wants to know, why did Britain commit troops on the continent, leaving no reserves in England? So did they do that? And if so, why did they do that?
Yes, they did do that. There's two reasons for it. One is Britain had an enormous empire to defend, and she'd just been placed in a strategic nightmare. he didn't have the biggest army to police the empire. So its military resources were spread thin. The next question, therefore, is why were the military resources spread thin, and why was there no reserve in the United Kingdom? And the reason for that is that between the wars, there'd been an enormous cutback in the expenditure on military expenditure. When Britain started rearming around about 1935, the question therefore becomes, what do we spend our money on? And the topical thing to spend your money on was the senior service, which is the Navy, which was the lifeblood of the British Empire and protecting British supply lines, but also the brand new toy. And the brand new toy was the Royal Air Force, but particularly Bomber Command. So when you look at the way that the military budget was allocated, 1935 plus, you'll see the biggest chunk was taken by the Royal Navy, and the second biggest chunk was taken by the Royal Air Force, and a tiny amount was taken by the Army. So the economic footprint of a tiny territorial military force was really quite small. And in 1939, when the British make a commitment to the French allies, saying, yes, we will produce soldiers for you, they commit 2 divisions. That is all they can.
Yeah.
That's the reason. It's purely a combination of strategy that revolves around Royal Navy and the Air Force, and the reluctance to spend money beyond that. And if I can just go on a little bit, there then becomes a dichotomy in the way in which they need to spend money on the Air Force. The big thing that's been pushed between the wars is that if you want a truly offensive capability, invest in bombers. This is the way you can hit back. And then suddenly there's a little bit of a swing comes around in 37, 38, when the people say, well, hang on, we need to spend money on defense. And between the two of them, they suck in even more money. And those are the principal reasons why there was virtually no reserve at home. The British Expeditionary Force, when it went off to war, was initially, barely 2 corps strong. The 3rd Corps that comes out in 1940 is staffed predominantly by reservists, and we have no armoured division. The 1st Armoured Division that goes out there is ill-equipped and really not designed to fight as a division. It's providing tanks just to support troops. And one of the reasons why it was so important to get the army back from Dunkirk, there was absolutely no military fibre left in the United Kingdom at all, apart from recruits coming through, conscription, barrack troops, and all the rest of it. That was it. Everything was out there on the front line in France.
Well, I just wanted to add too that part of the reason there aren't a lot of British troops in France as well is they don't need them. The French army is the largest army in Europe. It's considered the best army in Europe. It has the best equipment. The British troops that get sent to France it's a show of force. It's not meant to be, it's kind of a standalone thing. It's there to demonstrate to the French that they're allied to them, and it's meant to wave the flag and all. But that's not the focus of the British troops getting to France. And kind of another interesting side note is that my good friend Freddie Morgan is actually supposed to be a staff officer in that British Armored Division, and he's very excited about his new posting. He's going to handle some of the artillery and logistical parts of this division, and he gets there and he realizes that he doesn't have any troops to command because they don't have any of the stuff that helps support the tanks that are supposed to be in the field.
If we're going to have a drinking game every time we say Ghost Army, I think we should also take a drink every time we say Freddie Morgan.
There you go.
Did you bring a drink? We didn't even ask you.
There you go.
There you go. Right, thank you.
Chris, I think that's exactly right. And because of that, once you dig into that relationship between the Allies at that stage, you begin to see how really disconnected it was. You know, the British, as you say, were relying on this apparently stupendous French army,
right.
But there were very few strategic conversations.
Right.
You know, there was a complete lack of organization. You know, nobody was wargaming.
Right.
Nobody was trying to work out how lines of command work. Nobody was building up relationships between the various armies.
Well, I mean, there was a fair amount of antipathy between senior British figures and senior French figures about their allies' respective armies and fighting abilities too.
I think that's exactly right, and the antipathy goes back a long, long way, and it has the roots in the experience they had of fighting together in the First World War.
Right.
You know, there was a big anti-British thing amongst the French, and vice versa, and the French are desperately suspicious of the overall British strategy, which they don't just see as being a European war. They think the British Empire is out for the British Empire, and anything they can pick off from the French Empire is going to be part and parcel of the equation. So there's some really embedded distrusts, that's a very ugly word, in the relationship. More so, indeed, than in the start of the First World War, when in a similar situation, you know, tiny expeditionary force is meant to fight, you know, like a pendant, as it were, at the end of the French forces. But they had actually been discussing plans, strategy together for a period of time. Before the Second World War, it's all rushed in, and it really doesn't happen like that.
Right. Yeah.
So we get from Dunkirk. We do have one other question here, and then we do want to move on from Dunkirk to kind of the Battle of Britain, but we did get a question from Michelle, and I don't want to ignore it here, who asks, would it have made a difference if Britain had convinced the French to allow German POWs to be sent to England? And I want to confess, this is an issue I hadn't even heard of, so I don't know anything about it myself. I don't know about you guys.
Not I. Hugh?
I'm not entirely sure what the point is, to be honest.
Well, maybe it is that I suppose it's possible that if the French had captured a lot of Germans, which I'm not sure that they did, I think that's the point. Yes, I mean, this campaign happened so quickly. There was no time to think about German prisoners of war at all. Sorry, I apologize. I wasn't quick enough on the uptake. And this happened so quickly that there was no considered policy for German prisoners of war at all. Very, very few indeed were brought over to the United Kingdom in 1940 at all.
Well, I think it also should be kept in mind as we're talking about all this stuff. It all happened so fast. The Germans have no plan, right? And that kind of leads into the Battle of Britain. They're shocked and stunned that this has happened. And when it does happen, they all kind of look at each other and say, okay, so now what?
Yeah.
So one of the questions we get quite often is, well, if only Hitler had done this, or if he'd launched his invasion, or, they've done something different with the aircraft. The Germans have no plan for Monday morning, right? That's
exactly right. And if you read the books by Manstein and Guderian, they say exactly the same thing. There was no plan. Funny enough, there was a sort of plan in the previous planned invasion. Before you put the weight onto the sickle thrust, and the idea really was to try and smash through into northern France and hunker down. And they always understood that having done that, they'd be close to ports, if not directly onto the English Channel, but onto the North Sea, from which they'd be able to take some form of bombing war to the United Kingdom. But there was absolutely no plan as to what to do once you won at Dunkirk. Nobody conceived that there was going to be even Dunkirk. And in fact, their biggest concern, once they suddenly discovered they're in the driving seat, what do we do with the rest of France?
Right.
That famous thing where the halt order comes in, which prevents the panzers coming in and wrapping things up at Dunkirk. Part of the motive for that is we need to preserve our panzer divisions because there's a hell of a lot more fighting to be done. There's a whole war to be won down elsewhere in France. So there was no plan to take things forward to Britain at all. Apart from anything else, everyone thinks about it. When you get to the Blitz, if we can move on to that, the first day of the Blitz on the 7th of September 1940, that afternoon, about 4:30 in the afternoon, when the air raid sirens go, the German air fleet dedicated to that assault is somewhere south of 900 aircraft. I mean, that is a phenomenal logistical operation. I just think that implies when you get behind the scenes, they got to find aerodromes, they got to find supplies, they got to find railway lines that go from depots into, frontline aerodromes and so on and so forth. That's going to take a lot of time to get organised, and that has to be thrown into the mix when you look at this lull that happens in June and early July.
But then, of course, the lull, as you say, the lull stops. The Battle of Britain originally fought over the beaches over the Channel, and then in the ports and stuff. It eventually does come to London. It comes to the cities, and as Chris said early, it's all kind of one big event. It isn't really. There aren't separate days where we go, well. I mean, I know we have the Churchill speech where he says the battle for France have ended, the Battle of Britain has begun, and that's, I think, June 12th or something like that. But it's all one continuum. When does the Battle of Britain and the Blitz really start to threaten the cities and really become something that, you can no longer deny it's happening?
It really happens in middle of August, which is when the intensity of the bombing campaign ramps up. Before that, you've had various pulses, if you will, in the way in which the German bombing campaign has worked. I mean, initially you see a lot of basically probing attacks, trying to find out where the strong points are, where the soft points are. And bear in mind, the Germans have absolutely no idea that the British radar system is in fact a centralized system, which is a command and control system. They think that all those radar decks out there, which they know about, are plugged in locally. So in a sense, it's rather like looking at a long line of troops and they're trying to find out which are the good ones and which are the bad ones. And so you see this very confused picture whereby you see raids up in the northwest of the country, northeast of the country, way down in Cornwall. There's a tiny little railway station, Wells, called Monmouth, that gets a package of bombs. And then it gradually escalates up until the instruction is given to destroy the Royal Air Force in preparation for the invasion, which is going to be slated for the 15th of September. And so the operation to raise the intensity and now deliberately focus on the Royal Air Force is going to happen on the 12th of August. That's the launch date. Well, the fact of the matter is that the weather's pretty bad. There's some communication problem. So it's rather a desultory attack. By the time you get to the 18th, however, there's a major attack on the Royal Air Force, focusing on group number 11, which of course is the protection for the southeast of England and in front of London. So they're really on the front line. And the strategy is actually not just to destroy the Royal Air Force, but to try and knock out the capability of the Air Force being sustained in the front line. So coincident with that, they're also beginning to bomb where the aircraft industry are, where the assembly units are. These are some of the bigger industrial cities in the Midlands. And then you'll get another change of gear on the 7th of September, because the German perception of how they're getting on is rather more rosy than they think it is. They think they're beginning to win this battle. The fact of the matter is, German intelligence on the ground as to the effect their bombing is happening is very limited. For their intelligence, they're relying on the reports coming back from their bomber aircraft, their fighter aircraft, and reconnaissance aircraft coming in after the battle, looking down at the ground and saying, well, that looks as though we're doing some damage. And then, of course, the pressure increases and begins to concentrate on London. Initially, because industrial targets there, they want to knock out. They're looking, for example, the Avro factory in southeast London. They're looking at the oil tanks around about the Thames estuary and so forth. But then they decide, now look, we're going to have a real go before the invasion, which, bear in mind, is slated for the 15th. So the 7th of September becomes a really big deal.
Chris, did you want to jump in? You've changed devices there? Yeah. Are you just like going out for a walk every once in a while? Because
I'm on my phone.
So we're losing you again. So this is
talking, and I'll try.
Yes, I'll keep talking. It's after all something that I'm supposedly skilled at. So we were talking. So you have this this thing that comes out of this. We talked about, and this is something that Chris was really interested in. You have the spirit of the Blitz. The idea they've kind of moved to the bombing of London. There is tremendous damage. You have people who are sleeping in the subways. You have people carrying on, needing to deal with blackout conditions, and they have instructions and everything to do. And I think we do have the idea now that that morale was universally strong during this, and probably any realistic look at it would say that morale was strong in some places, but maybe not so strong in others. That places that were particularly badly hit probably had a much harder time dealing with it. And what's your take on that?
The fact of the matter is, the bottom line is morale generally held out. At no time was there pressure from the British public to alter the strategy of politicians, as say the conduct of the war. At no time were there mass demonstrations, people coming out and holding placards say, we want out, don't pursue this war any further. Having said that, one's got to look at the fact that it was a very picky picture. The brutal truth of the bombing campaign revolves around a single equation. And the single equation goes like this. To what extent can the intensity of the bomb damage during an air raid overwhelm the civil defense and the protection services on the ground? Now, in the case of London, they could never deliver the intensity that would allow the Luftwaffe to win that equation. Things were really tough and very nasty, particularly in September and October. There wasn't a universal system whereby people were sitting hunkered down, looking cheerful in tube shelters, all the rest of it. It was tough. And there were breakouts in the east end of London. A shanty town developed in Epping Forest because people voted with their streets. But by and large, that equation could not be won by the Luftwaffe. If you go somewhere smaller like Southampton or Clydebank or Coventry or places like Birmingham, the intensity of the bombing in just 2 days of raids completely overwhelmed the local services on the ground, let's say civil defence and all the rest of it. So your firefighting service didn't work. Your local command and control system couldn't work because either had taken a direct hit or the telephone system was knocked out, and there was no radio, and the messenger didn't work. So smaller places got it really tough. And if we could take Clydebank as an example, in March.
Is that in Scotland, Clydebank?
Glasgow. It's the downriver industrial heart from Glasgow. So you have shipyards, you have oil termini. The Singer factory used to make sewing machines, now makes machine guns and all the rest of it. Population 50,000. Over 2 nights on the 14th and 15th of March in 1941, 200 bombers each night came over. There was no nighttime security, no night fighters. So the aircraft were coming down to a slightly lower level, and they absolutely devastated the place. So of a population of 50,000, 30,000 were left unhoused. There's no food, no water, no gas. And people went to live out in the hills. They lived in railway tunnels. And there was a complete breakdown in cohesion. But the extraordinary thing is that within a week, most of the people who had jobs working in places like the shipyards and the factories were signing up and going back to work. So the picture is very, very patchy. And one shouldn't have this view that the romantic view that British morale was somehow endemic in the British people. It's something that has to be created. And it was created by leadership. The fact there'd been quite a lot of planning to cope with aerial warfare for a long period of time. So there was a structure that people could latch onto, and they could see the structure working. If you suddenly see that the firefighters are working, the demolition squads are working, the ambulance system is working, and after a period of breakdown, you can actually see that the rehousing system is working. Rationing was working, and that's incredibly important because ironically, the blue-collar members of society were actually eating better through the rationing system than they were eating pre-war, when they were eating a lot of sugared products. Now they're eating a much more balanced diet revolved around 4,000 calories a day. So all this preparation, the fact that civil defense creaking and groaning is in fact working, and also given the fact there is confidence in leadership, lies behind the explanation of the Blitz spirit.
I want to just mention, and we're, of course, this is History Happy Hour, and we're talking to Hugh Macdonald-Buchanan in the UK. I want to mention, another comparison with today. When you talk about how some of the smaller cities got overwhelmed, it was sort of the same goal initially of the economic shutdowns today and the social distancing and the masks and everything, was to flatten the curve, keep the hospitals and the medical system from being overwhelmed, so that it doesn't get completely out of control. And that's an interesting, to me, historical parallel that in sort of both these cases, you cannot prevent deaths, you cannot, in the case of the Blitz, prevent destruction, but you need to keep it to a level that you can keep civilization running. Otherwise, you kind of lose not necessarily through death, lose your populace, but you sort of lose the morale and lose the support for the war.
Absolutely. And the strategy before the war had always been, do you remember that great quote from Stanley Baldwin in 1932? Before
the
he
bomber
goes,
will always get through.
Bomber will always get through. And of course, this had been behind civil defense for a long period of time. But the calculation had always been, look, we can't protect everything. We're never going to be able to protect all the population. We're not going to be able to protect property. We're not going to be able to protect all our industry, all our ports, and so on and so forth. So the policy revolved around damage limitation. And once they started following that particular theme, the policy for the population revolved around dispersal rather than, for example, spending a lot of money on subterranean shelters. And they stick to that equation. And one of the success stories during the Blitz, and incidentally by the Blitz, I'm talking about 7th of September 1940 through to the 10th of May 1941, is how industry and government actually responds to the bombing campaign by sticking to the guns. They actually go for more dispersal, with the one exception that the one place that has a natural system of underground shelters is, of course, London. But at the start of the war, in fact, for the first 2 weeks of the Blitz, people weren't allowed to use their shelters. They had armed guards on them. Churchill was worried about people going underground and staying down there. And in the War Cabinet minutes, you see Churchill and the other members of the cabinet referring to them as troglodytes, underground dwellers who are going to stay there. But they changed their policy, and that was a big thing for London. Yes, but you're absolutely right. The government was making that decision that you've got to take some of this pain. It's inevitable. But at the end of the day, we're going to win the major part of the battle. So dispersal and protection and damage limitation is the way forward. But that accepts you're going to take a certain level of casualty. Now, it so happens that before the war, they anticipated casualty levels far higher than those who actually occurred, not just during the Blitz, but during the whole of the bombing of the United Kingdom throughout the war. So in the round, the statistics are somewhere in the region of 67,000 people lost their lives, and double that were what they call seriously injured, which means you're hospitalized, which compared what they anticipated. For London, for example, 200,000 people were going to be casualties they anticipated within 3 weeks. Factoring into that, they thought there might have been a gas attack. They thought the bombing might have been of greater intensity. And that, incidentally, I think was a failure of intelligence. They failed to look at the fact that Luftwaffe was a ground support operation and couldn't deliver intensity of bombing that they were actually projecting that they wanted to achieve over in the Ruhr with their offensive bombing fleet. So, but there was that calculation. Yes, you're going to have to take casualties, but on the whole, it's going to be okay.
We have a comment from a viewer who says, quoting Eisenhower, "For want of an internet connection, Chris was lost." I'm not sure what Eisenhower speech that comes from, but clearly he's here. Sometimes he's not here, but he's here at the moment. So, Chris, if we can hear you, join in and throw in a question.
I did not hear what you just said.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about I was inviting you to join in with a question, but I can also put up a question from one of our viewers, Neil Hilliard, who says, wants to know who took care of the London children when they were shipped out of the city. And people may not even know that many thousands of children were, for a while, I think, not permanently, but for a while, sent out of the city to stay in the country in a plan that didn't always work exactly as it was supposed to.
Yes, that's exactly right. Somewhere on those photographs I sent through, there's a picture of children being waved goodbye at the railway station. Evacuation was not just in London, the major cities, was a very important part of the policy, which was enacted in 1939 and also in early 1940. So in the first wave of evacuation from London, some of the region of 600,000 people were involved. This were children, pregnant mums with large families. It was a massive operation. Where did they go? Well, they went to towns, they went to the countryside, and families were told to take them in. They were, in a sense, conscripted. There was a hell of a bun fight between who's going to pay for all this, because central government in Britain devolved to a far greater extent the cost of war and civil defense to local authorities. So if you're the local authority where I live, which is in northwest Buckinghamshire, a lot of evacuees came here. But the question was, who was going to pay for them? The family taking them in would get an extra allowance of 10 shillings a week per child. That having been said, if you took 2 children, that allowance was reduced to 8 shillings per head. So little details like that had to be worked out. But they were taken out to country towns, to farms, and they created what they called a cushion area around about these cities. And later on, as the Blitz developed and the bombing of the UK developed, they used to build shanty towns within these cushion areas with prefabricated huts and canteens, because evacuation went beyond policy. It's policy, but people started voting with their feet, and they called it trekking. So, for example, you look at the Clydebank devastation, 30,000 people just got up and left the city. They wanted to go and live in the hills. These people had to be catered for. Same thing that happened in Southampton and Plymouth and Coventry and Birmingham. So you have to have policy catching up as well as policies pre-designed to evacuate people. Ironically, the phony war, when nothing happened, 39, early 40, meant that a lot of people came back into London. Evacuation at that stage wasn't compulsory by any means. People were given the option of leaving or not, and they came back. But that caused another problem. It wasn't just the fact that there were a lot of young people in town when the bombing started, but all the services that started supporting a community, like the sports field, the schools, the local bathhouses, the local swimming pools, they all closed down. There's nothing for these people to do. And you get a lot of kids, teenage kids and all the rest of it, roaming around the streets. You have a high spike in juvenile crime, which I might say in some cases was addressed by corporal punishment. So it's a very complicated story. In the case of members of my own family, and this happened to other people, they were evacuated not within the United Kingdom, but they spent the United States of America. My mother and my uncle, a couple of their cousins, were sent off the United States of America, and they didn't return until 1943 late, when they thought that the bombing of the UK was beyond bombing. They thought it was over. And they hadn't reckoned with the fact there was about to be a baby blitz at the start of 44, and of course vengeance weapons. And so they then had to be evacuated from London out of the countryside where they lived in the farming community.
Chris.
Yeah, guys, I'm sorry, I see you
beginning. But here you are.
So, what?
But here you are.
Well, here I am now. Yes, I heard Hugh talking about the children, and I don't know. You may have mentioned this, so I'm sorry. But again, one of the things that I found interesting that I've discovered is that most of those children came back. Their parents, once they adjusted to life under bombing, their parents wanted them back, and most of them came back to London. Which, again, I don't think, when you see the kids drive off on the train station in the movies, that's not how the story's told.
That's exactly right. And there was another evacuation later on, when the bombing started happening, they went back again. There's a film, isn't there, for children called Bed Knobs and Broomsticks?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
2 little evacuees go off and so on and so forth.
What do you mean it's for children, Hugh?
Sorry?
What do you mean it's for children?
Chris, you need your colours to the mast there. There's a big social thing about this evacuation. Some people absolutely loved it and made lifelong relationships. Some people absolutely hated it, and there you get those in that film. 2 little children. I think they're initially given a bed each. What's this? They come out of a tenement in working class London. They're used to sleeping 3 or 4 into a bed. Some people absolutely hated it. Some people were treated well. Some people were treated badly. Some were ripped off so they could benefit from the extra rations and the extra pay. It's a really big and complicated social story. But by and large, what Chris was saying, that initial emigration, which happens when people see that nothing's happening, a lot of them go back into town, and the town they left wasn't there anymore. There was no community. Communities have become discombobulated because of civil defense.
So we have a few more minutes to go. I wanted to mention to our audience that we had promised at the beginning and that we were going to have the Yakir Katz from Stephen Ambrose Tours come on and talk about, kind of give an update on where tours are going forward with the company, and particularly what might be happening or going on in the fall or next year. Unfortunately, Yakir has had a flat tire. He's out on the highway. He's not going to be able to join us. We will definitely try to put him at the top of the show next week so that we can cover that. Having said that, going back to our topic, we do have a question from Libby Meyer, who is trying to remember if there was a story about children being evacuated on a ship that was sunk by the Germans, but isn't that a kinder transport? Children, or is it children being evacuated from the UK to the US? I do vaguely remember the story as well.
There wasn't a particular one of specifically children being removed from the UK that was sunk by torpedoes, as far as I can recall. The amount of people being evacuated from the UK was actually very, very small, and they wouldn't have gone on huge. Some of them would actually flown out via Spain. That's what tended to happen, and indeed, that's exactly what happened to my mother and my relatives. They actually got a ship from there. They were getting neutral shipping to go across the Atlantic. I'm not aware there was one specific catastrophe that sunk a whole lot of children going.
And sometimes we don't know everything either. I know it's hard for people to imagine that or believe it, but it can also be true. I met somebody the other day, or I was talking to somebody the other day whose wife had been on a kinder transport for Germany, and she came to the UK, and she ended up spending, I think, 8 years with a family in the UK before she came to the United States in 1948-ish. And just amazing story. She had been, she was in the, she'd come to the UK, she was there in the terminal or whatever, and a woman comes over and is like, she's gonna, you're supposed to go with her. And the girl thought she was being sold into slavery. Now, she didn't speak any English. She didn't really understand what was going on. She thought she was going to be sold into slavery. And they said, no, this person is here to help you. And in fact, she had a tremendous experience. So those evacuation experiences, I mean, it's so strange to imagine a child suddenly having to deal with a foster family sort of under the most trying, difficult, and craziest of conditions.
Oh, crazy. And bearing in mind that the kinder transport was primarily a private enterprise. This wasn't government policy. This was individuals arranging it. Raoul Wallenberg was one of the famous ones, who was a member of the Swedish industrial family, and I think he was transporting. I think they were from Czechoslovakia. I can't quite remember, but it was through private initiatives, and it was up to those private initiatives who arranged. You mentioned the word fostering. They arranged homes for people here. Many of the people. I mean, I used to work for a bank called Rothschilds, based in London. They got involved in that kinder transport operation, but it didn't finish. Away from there to the UK, as you say, you had to find the families and places to go to be billeted in, and it was an extraordinary operation, but completely outwith of the state.
Well, we have Chris Anderson actually with us in this moment. Chris, this question is a softball. Don't apologize for the internet, Chris. It's not you. Okay. This is a softball question for you from Steve Nix, who says, "I'm dying to visit London through the lens of the Battle of Britain. A Stephen Ambrose style tour. Is this in the works?" What's the answer to that?
Well, absolutely. That was something that Hugh and I were working on before the lockdown. That was going to start in France to talk about the British fighting back to Dunkirk, get to Dunkirk, take the ferry over, do all the Battle of Britain sites, and then finish up in London with the Blitz. And we'd also taken the Battle of Britain air show. So if you go on the Stephen Ambrose site, check out the Battle of Britain tour. Right now it's still scheduled for September, but we know that that's all up in the air at this point, but we're doing it every year. So if it doesn't happen this year, it'll happen next year. So yes, definitely.
We as I mentioned, we were
for the talking.
Pardon?
Can I say something to Steve along those lines? The exciting thing, if you're interested in the London Blitz, going to London, is it is still very evident in the landscape there. You move through the centre of town, and the pattern of what happened during the bombing in the Second World War is there. You can see shrapnel marks on the side of certain buildings. Wherever there's a modern development site, you could bet your bottom dollar that's probably a bomb site. You go and see that famous image of St. Paul's Cathedral, which you showed, I think, at the start of the show. Walk around there, you can see exactly where the bombing happened. Not only that, you can see some of the buildings that show the type of building was there at the time. So you move through London, and you can actually see what happens. Helped by the fact that the Ordnance Survey, which was the mapping organization at the time, started keeping a record of where bombs actually fell, including V1s and V2s, and what sort of damage they did. So you had these amazing maps that you could walk through on a modern landscape. And I don't think I did send it to you, but I tried to, which is an overlay of a German Heinkel bomber over one of those Ordnance Survey maps, and that brings it to life hugely. So there's a lot you can see in London, just apart from the museums, just by moving through the landscape there.
Well, Hugh, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this internet-plagued, bandwidth-plagued edition of History Happy Hour, and patiently dealing with all of our problems. And it's a brave new world that we're all in, trying to do programming on the internet, and you have your hits and you have your misses, but it's been a hit being with you, and we really appreciate your being here. I want to remind people that I put the link up earlier to our reading list, that we have a reading list of stuff that you can look at related to our topics today, including Hugh's suggestions about what you should be reading, that you can view this program and all of our programs in the archive of History Happy Hours on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours YouTube page. Next week, God willing and internet willing, Chris and I will be talking to Don Farrell and talking about fighting in the Pacific. We're actually talking to him on June 7th. You might think we should talk about D-Day, but there's a whole lot going on in the Pacific on the same day or the same week and shortly thereafter. And so we're going to focus on that next week with Don. So Hugh, thank you so much for both Chris and I. He's dropped out again, but if he was here, he would say thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your being on History Happy Hour.
You're more than welcome. It was a great pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you.